Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the GCU for this Analytics Matters event, which is one of Willis Towers Watson's 3 sessions that we're hosting at COP26 in the Resilience Hub. I just want to thank our GCU partners before we start and the hosts for allowing us to run this event today. I'm Matt Foote. I head up analytics at Willis Towers Watson in the Climate and Resilience Hub, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here. We've been talking about this event for many weeks, many months, and it's an absolute pleasure to be in Glasgow to do this event now with you. I think this is a testament actually to the importance of resilience, that the Resilience Hub have focused on this particular session around analytics. I was just speaking to one of our colleagues, Professor Jim Hall, before we started about the importance of providing the trusted baseline of information that will allow confident decisions to be made around the challenge that we all face to deliver resilience against the changing climate risks that we all face. And that brings together the needs of every stakeholder. We have to work together on that approach. And so we're all facing that challenge. And to be able to build and build the resilience and the adaptation, we need to be able to build the global databases that are consistent, trusted, open, and curated, that allow every one of those stakeholders to be part of that process and to get the right information to make those decisions collectively. So before we start with the first event on this very interesting session, I just wanted to make the point that it's a very busy schedule. We bring in many expert voices together in this event for the next couple of hours to discuss these critical themes. And so, unfortunately, we'll have very little time for direct questions, but our rapporteur, Frankie Brown, and our virtual moderator, Tom Previtt, will be monitoring questions over the virtual link during the event. And if we have time at the end, we will try to cover those directly. But after the event, obviously, there will be an event summary where we'll try and reflect any of those questions directly. As I said, this event's title is Analytics Matters, the Bedrock of Resilience. And this was very carefully chosen, particularly because we believe that to reflect the role that information and intelligence needs to play, it needs to be accessible, open to all, and it has to play that foundation of building resilience across every one of those stakeholders, whether it's the financial sector, governments, communities working together, and developing that common understanding of the role and scale of future risk within those analytics tools. But like any foundation, the building materials and the construction of it are key to ensuring that what we build on top of that is stable and secure. And so in this sense, what's needed obviously is the ability to create global resilience based on that strong foundation of data and analytics that will then give that trust and confidence to all of the stakeholders that are involved. And equally, to ensure that when we talk about resilience, it's an equitable resilience, that everybody owns that data and information in a way that's possible to do so. I think Mark Carney this week referred to the need for discipline and transparency in both net zero and the Paris aligned transition, but as well as then for ensuring that we build a climate resilient world. This needs a truly collective endeavour to bring the financial sector, countries, communities and science together to build those tools and to provide that evidence base to ensure that we're providing the positive impacts that are needed to build global resilience. I'll stop there now as the introduction and invite our colleagues around the table now to talk about our first event, which I'm very excited to introduce, which is the launch of the Global Resilience Index Initiative, which is showing the way forward. This is the way forward by applying the approaches to future physical risk quantification, which are already being employed by certain elements of the insurance industry and the financial sector, but fueled by new innovative data, for instance, Earth observation data, artificial intelligence approaches, and the inclusion, very importantly, of ground truthing from the communities that are affected by these risks directly, to ensure that the models that are produced are global, consistent, truthful, and trusted. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rowan Douglas to give the launch statement for the GRI, and then to invite the panel members to give their views as well. Thank you. And please come along. So I'd like to invite, obviously, Rowan Ekashwe-Ihen from the IDF. I'd like to invite Kamal Kishore from the Centre for the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, Ben Caldecott from the University of Oxford and the Centre for Greening Finance and Investment, and to bring those to the table as well. Thank you, Rowan.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
And, it's a really, really special day, and we are so excited that the bits and pieces came together to bring this initiative to launch on Resilience and Adaptation Day here at COP26. There's a famous book, isn't there? I don't know, is it 12 Maps That Changed the World? Our aim is to create the 13th map that will change the world, actually cure the world of a pandemic that's perhaps more insidious, certainly more pervasive, and undoubtedly more deadly than the COVID-19 pandemic we're experiencing now. And it's a pandemic of climate fragility. We are creating an environment, a human environment, which is simply going to be unable to cope with and manage the risks we're facing. We should be able to see and understand those risks, but we don't. They're invisible. And they're invisible to the key systems we depend on for our governance. They're invisible at the moment to our financial system. They're largely invisible to our legal system. They're generally actually invisible to just our general knowledge systems. So this project, more than a project, initiative, has taken, yes, in some senses 1 year to prepare, but in fact, it's probably been in genesis by some around this table for about a decade and a half. We were talking about that, weren't we, Emma, just a few moments ago. But make no mistake, what we're about to talk about is not about liberating 100 billion here or 500 billion over there, or even 10 trillion over there. What we're talking about in the home of Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, who created the invisible hand that explained what was built, who prospered, who did not. We in this room today are the beginning, the retraining of the invisible hand to guide a prosperous but critically resilient future. So 245 years after Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, we are going to actually drive the wealth of nations and the protection of people and communities through this work. And just like real pandemics rely on seemingly obscure technicalities in laboratories to actually affect the whole global environment of public health, in the same way, some seemingly to many of us obscure technicalities in modeling of finance and physics, literally the transition of physics into finance, is going to be the magic cure to this global challenge. So it's great to have this remarkable lineup. The latest chapter in this journey, 12 months ago, almost the day, wasn't it, Ekashwe? Denis Duverne, who chairs the IDF, the Insurance Development Forum, he's also chairman of AXA, and Mark Carney, Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, and obviously, as many will remember, former governor of the Bank of England, convened a meeting to discuss what the insurance sector as a whole, through the IDF, could contribute to COP26. And there are many things the sector can contribute, but one absolutely clear and supremely distinctive area was in physical climate risk and resilience. And could we propagate the methods and metrics and data to allow all sorts of communities, financial, humanitarian, built environment planning, to develop a shared language and access to data that will allow us to, in some ways, mirror the beautiful simplicity of tons of carbon as a metric with a similar set of core metrics for, frankly, the more heterogeneous and challenging area of resilience. So that was the challenge that he set. And we were very lucky that at that moment in time, a variety of institutions, which you will listen to in a moment, had the right combination of people and talents and assets and timing to come together and make this happen, building on probably 15 years work. And we weren't starting from scratch. And if I just want to sort of summarize, if you like, the vision for what this is, 3 years ago, the UNDRR, and we'll hear from the head of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in a moment, Mami Mizuturi, produced one of the most remarkable geographical scientific outcomes. It was called the Global Assessment Report. It was the first ever globally consistent model and map at relatively high resolution of global climate and natural disaster risks as they stand at the moment, fully probabilistic. And it was a remarkable achievement over about 5 years, but it didn't perhaps get the currency it deserved. So we decided we need to emulate that, but put a forward gear on it for climate. And the other building block was something called the Global Earthquake Model Foundation, which was established about a decade, 12, maybe a little over a decade ago, which was really an enduring public-private partnership to provide open access earthquake risk information around the world. And it's become the most incredible standard for buildings, for planning, and has saved thousands upon thousands of lives. So we wanted to blend those two sort of heritages with the institutions here. I'm delighted with the efforts you'll hear about in a moment. We've reached the point where we can formally launch this initiative here at COP. By the next COP in Egypt, in around about a year's time, this platform will have moved from, if you like, planning and conception through to the first delivery of open access, multi-hazard climate risk information around the world. Of course, it won't be finished in a year. It'll be version 1, very useful globally, but it will be something that actually endures and builds, and critically then becomes part of the DNA of climate risk disclosure for people needing TCFD, for forecast-based humanitarian finance, and all the other needs that we have. So we may think, sitting in this room with just a couple of thousand people, that this isn't particularly big, or to the millions listening, but this is the beginning of something, hopefully, in its own way, a spark as important as the spark that happened here in Scotland 245 years ago with Mr. Smith. So who better to speak next than the UN Special Envoy for Disaster Risk Reduction, Mami Mizuturi, who unfortunately couldn't be here at this venue today. She's in Glasgow, but she had a clash she couldn't manage. Absolutely resolute in her support for this, and I think very happy that this builds on their previous work. So run VT, please.
Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, there is only one atmosphere, and it is shared by 193 UN member states. Together, they must find the will during COP26 to prevent a catastrophe unfolding in the coming decades. The longer we delay on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and investing in adaptation, the more we are allowing climate risks to propagate, undermining sustainable development and hastening ecological breakdown. The new emissions gap report from the UN Environment Programme states that we are on track for a global temperature rise of at least 2.7 degrees this century, far beyond the 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement. Current levels of global warming are contributing to wholesale changes in weather patterns and risk profiles around the world. The number of people displaced by extreme weather events reached over 30 million last year. Normal has gone forever. The impacts of climate change are outpacing our efforts to build resilience. The dynamic nature of the unfolding risk landscape across the world explains why we desperately need climate solutions based on solid science, data, and analysis. Improved risk analytics can underpin public and private sector action to support investments in resilience. This is why UNDRR is excited to be a partner in the Global Resilience Index being launched today, and I have accepted to serve as patron to this initiative. We see this public-private initiative to accelerate risk understanding as key to effective adaptation action and to UNDRR's own work on data analysis and capacity development. At UNDRR, we are rolling out a global risk assessment framework which combines climate data with data on vulnerability and exposure to inform development and humanitarian planning. We are helping small island developing states and least developed countries to establish comprehensive disaster and climate risk management approaches so that their DRR strategies and national adaptation plans are aligned. We are moving to a next generation of disaster loss accounting to assess the impact of the climate emergency and to frame preemptive actions. And we are establishing a center of excellence with the World Meteorological Organization to increase global understanding of climate risk. Working together across the public and private sector, I am confident we can foster the next generation of global risk analytics fit for the climate future. There is still hope that the world will finally act to rein in global warming. But we must prepare ourselves to live with and manage the consequences of the damage already done. I am confident that the Global Resilience Index will become a powerful tool that will guide all of us through this journey. Thank you very much.
Well, Mami talking there about effectively the climate emergency, the data emergency that's driving the climate emergency. We have two other patrons. The other one from the public sector is Mark Carney, which I'm very delighted about, not least because he put us up to the job. So he's staying with the initiative as one of our patrons. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here this morning either because of a conflict, but he did send a message and asked me to relay it, that obviously he's disappointed that he can't be here this morning with us all, but he's very pleased and delighted that we're launching this here at COP at the Resilience Day. He pointed out that he was at the inception of this project, and it's great to see how much progress has been made to get to this point based on a shared mission, experienced practitioners, and a collective spirit. He wants to thank everyone that you'll hear from today, including Nicola and Jim at Oxford, and Matt, and the wider task force team who's got us here. And he's delighted to continue his engagement with the initiative along with Mami and our other patron from the private sector, Eric Anderson of Aon, who, as many of you will know, is an important competitor of Willis Towers Watson's, but through the IDF, we collaborate. And I think that's the most exciting thing, that in this initiative, the mission is so important that even the strongest competitors in this area feel it's important to collaborate. So absolutely delighted that Eric Anderson has taken on that. With that, I am going to hand over to Ekosway from the Insurance Development Forum, Secretary General, who's been the group that's really brought this together. So Ekosway, great to have you here. You've been a huge advocate for this. So we'll hear from you now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rowan. It's really difficult to come after you and Mami. So I'll also keep it quite brief in that sense. And also given the time limitations. I just wanted to deliver some remarks on behalf of the IDF. I have three key messages. The first is that we are very proud that it was the Insurance Development Forum that Mark Carney, as Rowan had mentioned, asked to address the challenge of providing a global reference index for the assessment of resilience. As was mentioned, it was an idea that was born out of a series of roundtables that we had within the IDF, really thinking about how can the insurance industry really drive change when we think about the climate challenge. So I think that this request coming from Mark is really a great reflection of how the sector's risk management capabilities can and should have application beyond just traditional insurance mechanisms. And so the IDF is pleased to have provided a portal for that capability. The second message that I would like to send is that as an institution and across our membership, we also look forward to applying the outputs from the GRII, the Global Risk Index Initiative, in the work that we are also leading with the V20 countries, which are the 55 most vulnerable countries to climate change, on a public-private partnership on risk and resilience analytics. this is really important because for those countries, there's a need to deepen the kind of risk and risk analytics capabilities that exist. The GRRI tool will be invaluable for this partnership. It will provide a very useful strategic overview, helping us to identify priorities and set the scene for more locally country-focused work on adaptation, disaster risk financing, and DRM programs. This is a way in which we can make this material for the kinds of impacts and challenges that many countries and people are facing on the ground. The third point that I'd like to hit is that, like most of you that are in this room, I'm sure that you're acutely sensitive to the current status of the negotiations and the fact that this week, the discussions are going to be dominated by adaptation and loss and damage. And that's significant. So the work that we have embarked upon with the GRRII and the other endeavors that the IDF is engaged in is really important. It's not an academic exercise. It's the opportunity for us to contribute positively in a tremendous way, and the implications are potentially profound because lives and livelihoods are at stake. This effort is ultimately about democratizing the availability of risk information and ultimately building a shared language of risk. It is about access to information for public good. The demand could not be higher. And so for us, this is actually an important responsibility. In conclusion, I just want to thank our patrons, as Rowan had mentioned, Mami Mizutori, Mark Carney, and Eric Anderson of Aon, and who have really supported and shepherded this process and steered us in the right direction in terms of developing it and our work within the IDF. And of course, also to Rowan, Nicola, Jim, Matt, Ian, and Genty, Nick, and so many who have been involved in this process that are too numerous to list in making this a reality, and also for being part of a progressive, I think, and very practical way forward. As Rowan had mentioned, this is about building the necessary architecture to help all of us become more resilient, both developing and developing countries. So it's really a privilege and an honor to be able to be part of an exercise that's geared towards that. So thank you very much. Those are my points that I wanted to deliver on behalf of the IDF.
Said when I did the intro that this request from Mark Carney came at the most remarkable time because various other initiatives were just in the genesis of forming significant programs. But through a set of long-term relationships, we could see how actually, rather than work in separate nodes, we could actually bring all this together. And no more so than the Indian-led Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure that's led here by Kamal Kilshaw. And in discussions with Kamal, the CDRI has private sector involvement, really perhaps more government-led, as you'll hear. IDF perhaps a little more private sector-led, although with government support, but actually requiring a very similar modeling approach. In fact, using some of the very same teams. So Kamal, it's been absolutely fantastic to be able to work together with you on this. And thank you so much for finding a gap in a really busy schedule you have at COP to be here this morning.
Thanks very much, Rowan, and thanks everyone. It's really a pleasure and privilege to be part of this collaborative endeavor. So on behalf of CDRI, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, we are a coalition of 28 governments and 7 international organizations, including the CCRI. So 2 points of information and one sort of reflection. One is that within the context of the work of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, we are embarking on a contributory effort which will look at risk and resilience in major infrastructure system. Just last week, we signed an agreement with UNDP, the Chima Foundation, Engineer, and Norwegian Geotechnical Institute to produce a risk update for major infrastructure sectors in 18 months from now. That will be significant because in 2023, the leadership of G20 will be with India. So the idea is to have a flagship report on that by then. The second piece of information is that while there is a quantitative side to it, there is also a qualitative side to understanding resilience, how regulations work, what is the level of enforcement of those regulations and standards, how people perceive infrastructure services, what is the lived experience of people that infrastructure systems seek to serve. On that, with Jim Hall's team at Oxford, we're just in the process of launching. The prep work has advanced quite a lot. We've had a working group meeting to do a global resilience survey for infrastructure sectors. And my final reflection is that while we are talking about global resilience, ultimately all resilience is local. And where we see our role at CDRI is taking this conversation deeper at the national and subnational level. Rowan said that 2017 UNDRR report perhaps did not get enough traction at the global level. At the national level, it left even more to be desired. So we would like to use the metrics, the tools that come out of this exercise and take them to the national level for a deeper dive so that people actually, the governments actually use these tools. There is no glory in having a tool which is very good, but is not being used. To use those tools to actually guide investments at the national level. So very happy to embark on this journey with you. And I'm sure we have an exciting year ahead of us. Thank you very much.
No, Kamal, you couldn't be more correct about the need to actually have these this data and these tools sort of embedded. And I do think that it is quite likely by time we get together in Egypt that actually the metrics and data from this work at a national level will, we hope, form the basis of national statistics and certainly international financial statistics. Because until that happens, we don't have the inputs into both public and private sector. So very much hoping that through work with CDRI, we can make that happen. A couple of other institutions who I just want to shout out before we close with Ben. May seem odd, but another key group in this is the Global Earthquake Model Foundation. And I can imagine you scratching your heads thinking, why earthquakes? Isn't this about climate? But in fact, actually, although of course the hazard is different, actually so much of the remaining work is the same. The data on the built environment, human systems, fragility and vulnerability work and functions. And of course, many perils are actually hybrid. A tsunami created by a seismic shock propagates through the ocean and sea level rise, and will obviously have an impact there, or landslides. So actually much of the risk environment is hybrid. So wanted to acknowledge John Schneider and the team at the Global Earthquake Model who've had an incredible input over the last 2 years. And finally, want to give a shout out to the Coalition for Climate Resilient Infrastructure, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. We hope very much that they will be here, but the chair, John Haley, and Carlos Sanchez, who many of you will know, are actually speaking at the ministerial right now on resilience. Amongst other things, they will be talking about the GRI. And Emma Howard-Boyd, who co-chairs the coalition, is en route here. She's also, as many of you will know, chair of the Environment Agency and sat on the Global Push for Adaptation. She co-chairs that. Again, the CCRI, very much a key partner of this, and to get this data into the very DNA of infrastructure investment. So just want to acknowledge those important partners, as well as many others who have played their part in getting us here today. But certainly, if I had to pick a key team who have been at the heart of actually changing words on podia to actual something real, I must shout out Dr. Nicola Ranger, Professor Jim Hall, for the Centre of Greening Finance and Investment at the University of Oxford. Anyone involved in this field of physical climate risk and resilience will know those names, over many years. Nicola, Jim, the way that you stepped up in this initiative in April at a critical moment and basically filled the needs we had is something that we will all be eternally grateful for, and obviously the wider context in Oxford. So really thrilled that we can acknowledge you today and hand over to Ben Caldecott, who will be no stranger to many of you, leads the Centre for Greening Finance and Investment at the University of Oxford, but obviously having a huge influence across the wider green finance landscape. Ben, really thrilled that you could be with us today, and I think you're going to show us some fireworks after your speech. So just say run VT when you finish. And it's such a good show, I'm going to recommend that the panelists move to the move off now, because we've done our bit and we can watch it with everybody else.
Great, I wasn't actually told about the fireworks, but I'm looking forward to seeing them. My name is Ben Caldecott. I direct the UK Centre for Greening Finance and Investment. I'm also at the University of Oxford, where I run a research group focused on sustainable finance. And I've been asked by Nicola and Jim to say a few words about CGFI and why we're part of the Global Resilience Index initiative. So UK CGFI, we are the UK National Centre established by UK Research and Innovation to accelerate the adoption and use of climate and environmental data and analytics by financial institutions around the world. So not just in the UK, very, very global. And in essence, we're trying to translate all of this fantastic climate and environmental science that's been going on. Collectively around the world, tens of billions of dollars have been invested in climate and environmental science, whether that is climate risk models or Earth observation platforms, you name it. Some proportion of that is going to be useful for financial decision making, but currently a very small proportion actually makes its way into that universe. And in fact, some of us will know that some of that does make its way into that universe might not be used as appropriately as it should be. So we're about translating all of that. And our ultimate vision is for financial institutions around the world to be able to access climate and environmental data and analytics for any point on planet Earth, in the past, in the present, and projected into the future for all the major sectors of the global economy, and to cover as many of the material climate and environmental factors as possible, creating public goods that can support access, innovation, and also hopefully some new frontiers for commercialization. We began in April of this year. It's a consortium led by Oxford, but with Imperial College London, Bristol, Reading, Leeds, the Alan Turing Institute, and a range of other UK stakeholders and partners. So supporting climate and environmental resilience data and analytics is already, as you've heard, and we'll see with the cool thing that's going to happen at the end, is already part of what we are doing, and will continue to be a really important part of our work, particularly through our involvement in GRII. So I think there are also just a number of things I wanted to flag that I think are going to create a huge amount of demand for the global public goods that are being produced by GRI, in addition to some that have already been highlighted. So the first is last week on Wednesday, the UK Chancellor announced that the UK would introduce net zero transition plans across the economy, so large companies, listed, unlisted, covering asset owners and asset managers as well. CGFI is actually going to be co-leading the Secretariat to look at this through a transition plan task force, looking at what credible transition plans look like and the metrics and data required to assess those transition plans. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is that I think the logical, natural extension of this focus on net zero transition plans will be resilience plans. And I think that can actually happen fairly quickly. So the work that we're doing here will support that hopeful future regulatory step. And I'm sure many people here will be involved in making that happen. They're going to be new potential legal duties or interpretations of existing legal duties to contribute to societal resilience, especially after COVID and what we've seen in terms of a lack of resilience across our societies. And I think that's going to create demand for this. And then there's resilience-linked finance. So these new instruments, sustainability-linked loans, sustainability-linked bonds, the resilience component of that is going to be really very significant, I think. So those are just the three things that I think are very exciting. They're going to drive the demand for what we're doing through GRII. So lots of people to thank for their leadership. I really wanted to pick out Rowan and his team at Willis Towers Watson, and obviously CGFI's own Dr. Nicola Ranger and Professor Jim Hall, who are also colleagues at Oxford. And we look forward to working together in this incredibly important initiative. Thank you. Cue dramatic fireworks.
Natural catastrophes cost nearly $200 billion globally in 2020. Over the last few decades, 200 million people have died in climate-related disasters. 9 out of 10 of those have been in developing countries. In the year running up to COP26, the world has faced a triple climate, economic, and health emergency that will have a prolonged impact on millions of people's lives around the world. The climate emergency is already here. In August, the IPCC laid out the clearest picture yet of the risks to come and demonstrated the urgency of adaptation and resilience. But to solve the climate emergency, we must also solve a data emergency. If we are to win the race to resilience and align financial flows with climate resilient development, we need a shared understanding of risk across society. Until now, this essential information has been unavailable, inaccessible other than to the richest people in society, and incomplete and inconsistent even in the developed world. The Global Resilience Index initiative is about closing this data gap. Following the footsteps of the UN's 2017 Global Assessment Report, it tries to provide a common language of risk accessible to all. It's about providing globally consistent, reliable, basic risk information to inform resilience and adaptation. It's about providing the information needed to mobilize trillions of investment in adaptation and resilience, to integrate risk into decision-making across all levels of society, to protect millions of lives and enable resilient growth of our economies and societies. We are not starting from scratch. The GRI is an open collaborative platform with partners around the world sharing information openly with common standards. We draw upon the significant risk modeling expertise of the insurance industry, putting together the basic building blocks of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability information to provide an advanced probabilistic view of risk suitable for financial and economic decision-making. Our focus is on the extremes, the typhoons and floods, for example, that have the biggest impact on people and on our societies. But we also strive to deliver the next generation of analytics, an understanding of the systemic level risks, the interaction of climate with our economies and societies that can amplify risks and that we need to account for in our adaptation and resilience planning today. Our focus is global, but we're also able to drill down from the global to the national, the subnational, and even the asset level, the information needed by financial institutions for their disclosures and to really integrate this into the global financial system. This year for COP26, we'll deliver the first global infrastructure risk analytics platform, filling an essential data gap in our understanding of risk globally. This is based on advanced Earth observation, artificial intelligence, and big data techniques, which allow us to deliver this type of analysis at scale and make it accessible to all. Open data is a public good. This is about providing a common language of risk to mobilize investment into the trillions across society. This is about leveling the playing field in information for all. We call on you to be part of this resilience transition.
And just before we Nicola, what a remarkable show. You'll be seeing Nicola on the airwaves in the coming years, so get ready for it. Could I kindly ask those folks who are on the panel, others who have been involved in the Euro, just to come to the front, we're just going to take a picture, and then thank you, GMAT, and then we'll get on with the rest of the event. I think it's a great way to kick off this analysis. Please be quick, including Nicola, Tim Hall, come out. Up we're going to get a little photograph taken of our launch day, and then no one will pretend they weren't here. So everyone's on the hook. Hiding in the back. think I hand over to Matt. Take it away.
Very much, Rowan. Wow, how do I carry on from there? That amazing start to a day. We're going to just show now, I think, the agenda. If we can get that up on the screen, just to show everybody what we're going to do for the rest of the session, if that's possible. In the meantime, I can actually say we're going to have 2 panel sessions, which are going to cover what I've been sort of thinking of, both as the supply side of developing and delivering open public good data sources, but then also to also think about the demand side and why we're doing this. What's the impact potential of developing data sets like the GRI and others that we're going to showcase in this session, and why these things have value, why they have impact, and why that is important. In the middle, we're going to have, hopefully going to have some, for those in the room, we'll have some light lunch available. And in that period, we'll be seeing some really nice showcase examples of practical elements to the global provision of public good data, the key elements that are absolutely essential. We've already seen, obviously, that we're not starting from scratch, but there are some challenges still to be dealt with in terms of providing accessible, consistent data that are, as we said at the start, trusted and understood and transparent. And that requires a number of elements to be put in place to deliver, including the GRI. So without further ado, we're going to move on to the first panel. And I'd like to invite to the panel some colleagues who are effectively the representing the leading deliverers of the core analytical sources and tools that are absolutely critical to the foundation of tools like the GRI and more broadly around public good analytics and data. And we're going to start to focus on a key question, I think, on that supply side, which is how open data and modeling is and can promote and encourage increased resilience. So it's a very simple question, but I think we'll start to open that out into some very interesting areas with our panel. And so I'd like to invite the panel up to the stage now. Christoph Christian, who is the Data and Innovation Impact Lead at the University of Oxford Centre for Greening Finance and Investment. So Christoph, if you'd like to come up. Emma, I've got two leading lights from 2 different organisations who are effectively building the world's first global flood models. So I have Emma Raven, Head of Research and Development at JBA, and Jeff Neal, Co-founder and Chief Scientific Officer of Fathom, to join us. Welcome. We also then have Professor Jim Hall from the University of Oxford, who is a Professor of Climate Environmental Risk at University of Oxford. And finally, but not least, James Lay, who is the Commercial Director of the NASDAQ Risk Modelling Group. Welcome. And so, and Mark, sorry, and Mark Lehman, I apologise, Mark. And Mark Lehman, of course, from Jupiter Intelligence and also from OS Climate. Apologies. So without further ado, I'll start with the question to all of you. And if I can start with you, Jim, if that's okay. We've just seen the GRI as a great example of global public-private initiatives that can deliver those consistent risk metrics that we've already noted are absolutely critical across a wide range of stakeholders as well. So clearly, this is going to need a significant investment from all the partners to deliver that, as well as then making sure that the design and the delivery mechanisms are of the various risk metrics that will be needed for each stakeholder are appropriate. So I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the key priorities as we start to construct these models to build that consistent source of credible and trusted data? What do you believe are the most important elements from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Matt. And actually, before I answer that, a bit of credit has been piled in my direction, but I'd really love to acknowledge all of the people within my group in Oxford who've been working incredibly hard to deliver some of what you just saw. And I'm going to call out some names here. Tom Russell, Jasper Vershaw, Raghav Pant, Tim Fowler, Natalia Thachenko, and Tybalt Lassing, who've been storming away in the back room to deliver some of these maps and numbers that you've just seen. So none of this was down to me, it was all down to them. what next? I mean, as we've heard already, we're definitely not starting from scratch here. We've had reference to GEM, to GAR 17. There are a number of other really important public products out there. And as we'll hear from other members of the panel, there's an incredible innovation in the private sector as well. And I think a lot of what GRRI is about is to do with leveraging that private enterprise and interfacing that with data as a public good. And I think that's one of the things which GRRI should be able to do most effectively, because we're just about to hear from loads of cool things within the private sector, which are working very actively in this space. And GRRI has, I think, a unique role in bringing those initiatives together. And so the journey is really towards providing consistent frameworks at a number of different levels. Part of this is at quite a conceptual level, because we've got a number of different audiences here which are looking to the same sort of thing. We've got an insurance audience, clearly, an investment audience, a humanitarian audience, a disaster risk reduction audience, and then a number of different sectors, utilities, agriculture, so on and so on. So there's some conceptual work to set out a kind of framework by which those different pieces can be put together and talk to each other. And then there's some mechanics underneath that, which goes down to the level, basically, of software engineering in the end, to bring these various pieces together. Just while I'm talking, I will point out a few kind of technical issues which are at top of my hit list. One is around climate conditioning of climate-related perils, that we have reasonable statistical data at the moment, exactly the ways in which we use what we know are highly uncertain climate model outputs to condition that statistical data. We need more work on. And then there's real gaps in our knowledge of assets on the ground, not necessarily where they are. We've got done a fantastic Earth observation of where they are, but actually the physical vulnerability of those assets, how they're interconnected, their interdependencies with infrastructure networks, the condition, the design standards. Kamal mentioned this in relation to the survey which CDRI is launching to find out more about design standards, standards of operation and maintenance, the institutional frameworks, which are so important for determining the vulnerability of assets. And then the final thing I'd just remark upon is then the flows between assets, and not only the infrastructure flows, the power, the water, the transport, but then the supply chains which depend upon those transport networks, which are one of the main ways in which the systemic risks that we've heard about can be propagated up to a global scale. The shopping list is longer, Matt, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to hand over to Emma and Jeff now, because as Jim's already said, one of the key challenges is to look to the forward gear for the physical hazards and perils that are affecting the globe, obviously, increasingly uncertainly. And I think I'd like to hand over to two of the experts who are building the global models to build that climate conditioning into the physical hazard side of what we're doing with the Global Earth Resilience Index, and then more broadly with our open analytics. And really just to ask you, I have to say I'm of an age where music plays a great part in my life. And I remember that some of you may know who Joe Strummer was from The Clash. And he always said the future is unwritten. So I wanted to use that as a phrase to link this, because obviously both organizations that you're involved in, JBA and Fathom, alongside others who are doing equally sterling work like Cat Risk, you're creating these globally consistent forward-looking models in an uncertain future. And traditionally, as we know, flood has actually been the hardest model to build anyway, in terms of the complexities of present day flood. So, I mean, I was just going to ask you both to make a few points and views on how you see this new dimension of complexity of the future of flood risk being captured in the way that we can then build these models. And then obviously also, as you've already alluded to, we're opening these models up to new end user stakeholders who have not been traditionally using those types of models. So if I could ask firstly, Emma, if you could respond to that question and then move on to Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so as Matt's explained, I work for J Risk Management, and over the past 5 years or so, we've been building global flood data and a global flood model. And more recently, we started to include climate change into our methodologies to look at that forward view thinking. And I think there's 3 things I want to touch on, building on our experiences as to how we've overcome some challenges to get to today, but also where we go in the future. And they're around, I guess, stuff we've already heard about, data, about innovation, and then about the need for sort of consistency and standards around this. So we know that flood modelling requires data, but particularly when you're looking at something like a granular level of flood, we want high resolution. We need to look at this at a very detailed level, yet we're trying to consider this on a global scale. So data becomes really, really paramount. And of course, there have been, big improvements in data quality, particularly around terrain data. But there remain substantial limitations, areas of the world that are data poor, or where we've got spatial or temporal resolution of data that isn't, what we need. And so that's why things like open data inputs for us become really paramount and important. And again, from the climate setting, having open climate model data has really enabled us to bring those into the modeling systems that we've got. But I guess it's some of those limitations in the data that we have that has driven innovation. And, again, a good example of machine learning has become kind of commonplace amongst the modeling that we're doing to try and deal with issues around data and methodologies. And certainly that's helped to kind of provide, jumps forward in what we do. And again, just reflecting on when we set out to generate the first global flood model, it very quickly became aware that the volume of data and the method and the way that we build these models needed to be changed, needed to shake up. And the traditional ways of building, in our case, catastrophe models, needed to move forwards. And so we brought in innovation there and how, again, much more linked to software, of how we can actually build these models much more dynamically. And we talk about this being running things on the fly to enable these global level assessments, these global level models. And so that's just leads to my kind of final point. Then, as we see more and more climate conditioned models and data coming onto the scene, I think the importance, and again, we're going to come on and James is going to talk about this a bit later, around the need for kind of framework and guidance on consistency here, because we'll be faced with a situation that, again, our users will have multiple different models, multiple different inputs and methodologies, and having sort of guidance on that element, and also on knowing and transparency, to promote transparency in the different models that are available to help understand them, I think becomes really critical, especially when we look at the future and our climate change views, when all of a sudden we have multiple different views to start to consider. So I'll hand over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Matt. So I guess I'm going to agree with pretty much everything Emma said and build on that a little bit. I mean, we've come an awful long way in modelling of flood hazards, particularly globally. I think 10 years ago, if you look back and I'd said we're going to build a global flood model, you would have been met with a lot of skepticism. And so I think we've come an awful long way. We've now got modelling systems set up that can run globally. They run for present day, and they'll evolve now to run into the future. And we'll use those in a catastrophe risk context. But I think there's still a lot of work to do, particularly if we're going to bring these out of the insurance sector into other areas. One thing that's really paramount is that it's quite easy to build a global flood model, give it a lot of precision, and then believe that that's a great data set. And so we really need to work hard on how we go about evaluating these models and validating them, and building confidence in the data sets that we're creating, so that other sectors, perhaps less familiar, can pick up a standard set of metrics or information about our models and understand whether they're going to be useful to them or not. So I think that's really critical. And actually, I think it's critical that we start to think about also moving towards looking at maybe multiple views of risk, particularly in flood. We've traditionally been very siloed, different groups with very, very expert people looking at a problem and coming up with slightly different solutions, much like the climate modelers think of the climate as a series of data sets that tell them about their future climate risks. You need to move that way also with flood and other perils. So I think that's really important as well. And then the other pillar that we need to build on is to keep bringing in new data sets as they become available, particularly open data sets from Earth observation. Data sets on resilience and exposure have always been pretty poor in the past, and as they improve, we need to keep building upon those and build out that way. And I think the other thing is our models need to become more aware of the influence that humans have on the hydrological systems that sit underneath the risk. So what's the role that infrastructure is playing on the system? How do dams affect flows? All these really kind of conceptually quite simple, but actually at the global scale, incredibly complex and difficult issues to deal with. How do we bring all that together? And I think these kind of forums are the way that we discuss how we set out the frameworks to do that, plan ahead, and have some standard ways to judge the quality of our outputs and to bring them together as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. And absolutely, I think those questions and challenges around how we bring these things together and fully understand how to integrate not only the physical processes, but make them relevant to the risk challenges and the risk problems that we're trying to answer is critical. And I think that brings me then on to Christoph, because obviously, Christoph, you've been central to the development of globally consistent data, which looks at producing the information that we can link on the real assets that are actually at risk, the things that matter, the things that matter to people, that aren't just an element of an abstract modeling environment. They actually have to mean something to those who are making decisions, that they have value, that they have importance and critical impact on people's lives and livelihoods. And so obviously sometimes it's a bit that's missing from people's thinking about how we model risk, and it's absolutely critical. So I wanted to just ask you, given your experience of developing these globally consistent, what we would call exposure models, but are effectively the assets that are in the way of physical perils like flood and others, how you see that progressing? What do you see as the major features of that whole process of developing those real asset models? What are the challenges? Are there challenges around accessibility of data? Are there challenges around how that data can be consistently captured? And very importantly, I think, how we can make those data sets relevant to each of the end user stakeholders that we've identified. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. And well, thanks for inviting me in this panel of amazing speakers. And I'll try to answer your very broad question in break it down in a couple of ways. So maybe as a bit of background on why these real asset databases or asset level databases are important, or exposure databases, as Matt describes them, why they're relevant for so many different use cases. So with the University of Oxford, we've set up the Spatial Finance Initiative a couple of years ago, which is really around trying to mainstream geospatial data and analysis in financial decision making, and very much for more of the medium and long-term investment decision making that was kind of traditionally not really looking at these type of data sets for despite the usefulness across a range of use cases. And this is relevant really for two reasons. Firstly, the climate and the nature or many of the social crises that we talk about today, they're inherently spatial. Everything is happening somewhere. The impacts or the risks manifest themselves differently depending on the local context. So if financial institutions, ranging from pension funds to insurers to banks, asset managers and a range of others, want to really understand climate risks, opportunities or impacts in a meaningful way, they need to do this through a spatial lens. They need to understand this in a spatial way so they can actually address and manage these properly. And then the second thing that we've been seeing, and has been mentioned by some of the panelists, is that the last couple of years, let's say the last 5 to 10 years, we're seeing quite an exponential increase in the availability of data, particularly Earth observation data and geospatial data, which is really a super useful source of information that tells us what is happening on the ground, what is happening at the real asset level in near real time, and really at a kind of global coverage. And in a time where the debate, particularly for climate risk data or ESG data more broadly, is all around lack of data or lack of quality data, Earth observation data can be super valuable and useful to plug some of these gaps or complement what is out there. But to make these data sets and these concepts of spatial finance and linking geospatial insights to investment decision-making, to make them relevant and real, you need to know where these assets are located. You need to understand where the critical assets in our economies are located, who owns them, what they look like in terms of capacity or age, etc. You need a basis of exposure information to really enable a wide range of use cases, ranging from risk management, but equally to transition risk assessment, transition plan monitoring, or even enabling engagement between investors and investees. And this is really what the GeoAsset project within the Spatial Finance Initiative, and I think will be highlighted in the next demos later, is all about. We really want to create open global asset level databases for the key high impact industries in the real economy. So decoding the real economy, very much like the Human Genome Project tried to decode the human genome, and really trying to break down the most impactful economic sectors into their individual assets. Where are they located? Who owns them? What are the key features that you need to enable a wide range of insight and value add analysis, such as resilience analytics, such as hazard modeling, such as a range of other less physical risk related applications. So that's what we're trying to do, trying to develop these on an industry by industry basis, and then make these available openly as a global common good, if you like. And why should they be global? Why should they be open? Well, global, because obviously these sectors and investors operate in global markets. So you need to have a wide breadth of understanding of these industries and be able to benchmark across companies and locations, etc. But more importantly, why should they be open? They should be open, we believe, because this type of data can really increase transparency across the financial system between not just investors and investees, but also, between regulators and investors or investees, and between civil society and more broadly between the whole breadth of stakeholders in society that have benefit in understanding those. And by making them openly, equally, you create a level playing field for countries, organizations with less resources to pull this data together themselves, or to pay for those from commercial providers, and really make sure that we're creating the pressures from multiple sides to drive resilience, to drive climate action, by making the data available across the board. And the way we create these databases is by pulling together the relevant openly available information where we can find it. And this ranges from corporate reports to country databases to Earth observation datasets and open geospatial datasets from OpenStreetMap or others, and pulling them together in a kind of automated or centralized way, and creating consistent databases that provide a core set of standardized information across these assets that can then be used by multiple users. So we use a lot of Earth observation data. We build machine learning models on top of those to identify additional assets or characterize them in areas where the data otherwise would be scarce, and really, to fill databases and get as much coverage as we can as possible. We've been doing this for cement and iron and steel sectors, and we're looking to expand this in other areas. But some of the challenges that we're seeing in this approach and in creating these databases more broadly are indeed around the consistency and availability of the underlying data that we are using to centralize and pull together these databases. In many countries, there is not very good data. Many companies do not report, so particularly on ownership information, it's very hard to collate this into a centralized way. But I think the way of going about this and the way we're trying to address these challenges is by, on the one hand, leveraging multiple data sources and working across different sources of data, pulling in new data sources such as Earth observation, but also other information from regulatory and permits information that we're trying to scrape automatically. But most importantly, it's around validation and working with the community and organizations such as GRI and the various partners and people on the panel here on validating this data, on filling the data gaps in this global understanding, and also just to keep these data sets updated. Because another main challenge is obviously, these assets, they're static, but they're also not static. The elements of exposure change, ownership can change. And to keep this updated in an efficient way that is valuable for all of us, it's important to work together with the community and actually pull that together. And this is what I'm trying to achieve by doing this in an open way and working with GRI, Willis Towers Watson and others. So that's, I think, a snapshot of how we're trying to approach some of these challenges that you've referred to now.
Thank you, Christoph. And obviously, I think what that says to me personally is how it's critical that that sort of data, as you said, is owned and validated by local communities as part of that drive towards building that transition resilience that's necessary, because obviously these assets are, in many cases, will be ones which are needing to transition themselves, and they then need to be able to be resilient in that process as well. So it's a critical part to be able to provide that information which acts as the glue effectively between the physical hazards and those assets which are critical and will continue to be critical as they transition to those economies locally and to the communities. And so, you know, as we said, I read from that the collection of that global data on a curated and consistent way is going to be absolutely critical to creating that global view that will underpin things like the GRI. And that moves me on to Mark, actually, because obviously, Mark, from your perspective, and we talk a lot about this just generally, but the forgotten part, obviously, in many cases for the whole of the risk calculation side and the modeling is the vulnerability. How assets, whether that's physical assets, real assets like the ones that Christoph's just mentioned, or actually indeed natural assets, which we mustn't forget as being an absolutely critical component to this, how they respond to these physical impacts, the physical processes, and then, you know, obviously how that can then be assessed within the models in the most appropriate way to make sense to those who need to make those decisions about what resilience actually means, whether that's resilience physically, whether it's resilience in terms of financial risk transfer mechanisms or other mechanisms that can be used to mitigate and reduce the impact potential for those assets. And so I just wanted to ask you what your views were on that vulnerability element, how we can incorporate vulnerability in a way that actually will make sense to create the risk metrics and outputs that are needed by every stakeholder.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here on the panel together. As Matt mentioned, I'm part of Jupiter, based in London, and it's worth mentioning perhaps first that Jupiter is very proud to be one of the first private sector companies involved in the open source climate data initiative. And through the Jupiter Promise, you know, we continue to provide physical climate data to aid the OS climate initiative and for the benefit of underserved communities and countries. I would say just on the vulnerability piece, and it's a really interesting one actually, because we talk a lot about hazard components of the risk equation. I would say on the vulnerability, very much it addresses the so what piece of risk. So we know to what we're exposed and roughly to what severities, but having real good vulnerability information helps us actually quantify the risk from monetary values, typically property damage and business interruption. So I think what we would like to see going forward is more open repositories around good quality vulnerability information. And that could be across different asset classes, residential, commercial, industrial, but also to Matt's point, not just physical assets, but also vulnerability to nature, vulnerability to biodiversity infrastructure, and various other things that we typically don't look at necessarily in the insurance sector. So having that openness, having that accessibility to more vulnerability and resilience information, I think is key. And it's not just about modeling, it's also about how that data is delivered to the end user. So, you know, being able to communicate uncertainty around some of those results, but also not just having static vulnerability information, being able to tweak or adjust those vulnerability functions as things change over time. And we tend to get stuck a little bit in static. How do we adjust changes to buildings, changes to landscapes, you know, to keep ahead of that climate impact. I suppose one last thing to mention is one thing I've personally seen from working 20 years in the insurance sector is a challenge is often supply chain disruption. And James brought it up earlier, is we do a pretty good job of assessing the impact of physical damage and direct business interruption, but the broader macroeconomic impact of supply chain disruptions, whether it's through infrastructure and things, is an area which I'd like to see more research into, being able to assess that broader impact. And there is a lot of initiatives underway, but it's in individual spaces or places. It's bringing that all together so that governments and companies, organizations can have a tool that really provides that interconnected systemic risk management element. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark. And totally agree in those points around obviously the need then to make sure that the risk assessment processes and the information and metrics that come from it do make sense to those end users in that way. And it's going to be a challenge. I think that's one of the major, I see as one of the major challenges, is that picking up and capturing the vulnerability components effectively, which make this a risk assessment rather than just a hazard or a physical peril. So thank you for that. I'm just going to hand now lastly to James. James, obviously, you know, we've heard already from Rowan and Jim and Kamal as well about the fact that we're not starting from scratch when it comes to how we deliver these, the platforms that are needed. We've seen examples obviously in the GRI already that there are tools like Oasis, the loss modeling platform that's been available, again, driven largely at the start by the insurance industry, but now more broadly applied, particularly through the Insurance Development Forum, but elsewhere. We've also seen Global Earthquake Model Foundation and the Global Earthquake Model process, which, you know, we'll hear from John Schneider, actually, who's the Secretary General of GEM, later in the second panel. But, you know, these things, obviously, from your perspective, where NASDAQ have actually taken those open architectures, the ability to use open framework standards, you've operationalized that, and you've made a robust, commercially driven, but obviously open approach to bringing together multiple models. And one of the things we also obviously have to recognize is that there will be no one source of information. We've got to be able to collate information from different sources to be able to take the best of what's available and make the most sense of that. And so obviously we need that framework to encompass that variability in information and the sources of information. And obviously from your perspective, where you've also with NASDAQ and Oasis and the IDF been promoting and being the leaders of building open standards, for instance, the open exposure database, which is now being commonly used across your platform, but more broadly within the IDF community for insurance. These are examples of how open data and models can be developed. And so I just wanted to ask your opinions from your experience about how you think that platforms like the NASDAQ risk modeling for catastrophes platform, which is based on Oasis and Oasis itself, they're going to have to evolve. How do you see them evolving to reflect not only this wide scope of modeling sources that we're going to need to build around, particularly the GRI at global scale, but then the local models that will need to be underpinning that so that we get to that local level? How you see those evolving, what we need to make that happen effectively, and then where you see the future for that? Where do you think we're going to go with that whole idea of building open platforms?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. There's quite a few kind of areas to think about there, but I think, as we've already mentioned, you know, the insurance industry has been using catastrophe modeling technologies for sort of 30 years or so, and it's tried and tested. It's pretty robust, you know, and I think that's important consideration. You know, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We've got a lot of these technologies available now. It might not necessarily speak the language that some of these other industries might need, but it could. That's the point. And as Mark said, you know, because it considers vulnerability as well as hazard, it makes those tools all the more powerful for that. So it's not just where future events could strike, but also when they do strike, what's the amount of kind of physical damage that's going to be caused. So I think, yeah, it's important to sort of make that point. The other thing to mention is obviously that catastrophe models are based on historical data primarily, so what's happened in the past, and climate models are projections of what's going to happen in the future. So, you know, there is uncertainty in catastrophe modeling. There's even more uncertainty in climate modeling. So in order to kind of ensure that the people that are going to use this data understand that, I think we need to be quite clear on that. And there's an opportunity, therefore, to engage with the community that's building these models to look at standard ways of approaching some of these challenges. And I think that enables then the end users to be able to look at how these models have been created in a uniform way, which makes their life a hell of a lot easier at the end of the day. So we've done something similar to this in the past. You alluded to it earlier. So a group of companies led by NASDAQ, along with Oasis and a number of insurance companies, we kind of created an exposure data format that was open and usable by anybody. It's now curated and managed by Oasis and published on GitHub. So anyone that wants to can go and look and use that format. And a number of people across the industry are kind of have taken that and run with it and made it their own. So I think that's a demonstration of how this can be hugely powerful in democratizing the use of these modeling technologies. The fact that the standards are open means that kind of anyone that wants to build a model for this purpose can do so, and they don't have to spend a penny on kind of making that happen, apart from obviously their own time and effort and resources. The actual software platforms are there for them to use. And because we've kind of already been through the process of doing this once, it seemed logical that we could look to leverage that experience in the physical climate space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I think we all recognize the fact that these standards can't be created in isolation, and they shouldn't be proprietary in nature. That's the key. The openness is extremely important and ultimately extremely powerful for everybody. In terms of evolution, so just briefly on the NASDAQ platform itself, we created a platform that's born in the cloud. It's delivered via our software as a service solution. And it's an independent platform for anybody to distribute catastrophe modeling or weather modeling software. It's powered by another open source software tool called the Oasis Loss Modeling Framework, which again is a standard, so an open standard. So effectively anyone that wants to build a model in an open format can do so, and then we can publish it on our platform. So we've effectively built a modeling marketplace, if you will. It's been running since 2017, primarily servicing the insurance industry, and there's models on there already from some of the companies that are sitting up here as well, covering over 300 different countries and perils. So in terms of evolution, I would say this, because of the scalability of the technology underpinning the platform, it's kind of ideally placed for servicing the physical risk market across industries, insurance included, but also outside of that. However, there are a number of things that need to happen in order to aid the utility of it. The ability to integrate acute and chronic risks, for example, is one. The ability to produce value metrics for other industries, and also the need for effective standards for model comparison, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the presentation to follow.
Thanks very much,
James.
So from everybody's comments on the panel, I think some common themes that I've sort of identified, I think here are, obviously we're in a period of rapid development of the technologies, the data, and the underlying information from modeling sources, from, as we said, new ability to capture data from Earth observation, satellite-based data, which is providing a whole new source of information in terms of real-time and truthing data. But obviously also we're entering a new generation, I think, of these models where they're becoming more relevant to that broader need. And that means that, again, it's got to be something which is delivered where there's a mutual contribution. It has to be a collaborative effort. We can't have individual sources of that information. We've got to be able to bring this together from every source of expertise, including, as Christoph has said very clearly, I think we need to bring the local knowledge into this. There has to be an equitable sharing of that data as well, so that there's a mutual understanding of where it's from, its provenance, and mutual trust. And so I get that very, very strongly from everybody's comments here. But I think the biggest thing here for me is the collaborative need, and that is underpinned by that ability to build interoperable, connective, and very open, transparent platforms that allow people to share that information in a way that makes sense, which in itself needs standards. And so without the standards, I think Dickie Whitaker, who some of you know, who is actually the lead of the Oasis loss modeling platform, said to me this week, he said, without it, we have data anarchy. And with data anarchy, you have no trust. Therefore, to have this working, we need that framework. We need the ability to bring data together, which is something that we will pick up on with James as well in a moment in terms of some ideas around that. I just wanted to thank the panel for their contributions for this first panel session, just to say that from going forwards now, the next part is going to be 3 presentations which showcase, as we said, some of the elements of what we've discussed. Firstly, we'll have Nick Moody from the Insurance Development Forum talking about the Global Risk Modelling Alliance, which is building models of catastrophe risks and elements of catastrophe risk to support the most vulnerable countries, the V20, directly through linkages with the UN and the tripartite agreement. Unfortunately, Nick can't be with us today. He unfortunately got, as we say in the UK, pinged by the COVID check and trace system, so he's unable to join us in person, but he will be on the virtual system, and we will see him on the screen. And we'll then be joined again by James to talk about the very thing we just talked about, which is standards and the ability to build an open standards framework to do exactly what we've said about conditioning future-looking models and the needs for those, and what we believe are the most important aspects of that. And then finally, a showcase presentation by my colleague Nalan Cabby over there, who's going to give a presentation on a joint flood modelling exercise in a project where we're piloting with a number of our partners here and colleagues the ability to bring new science to condition flood modelling with a forward-looking gear, but then also to integrate the open exposure data, which makes it relevant to the needs of each of the different stakeholder participants and recipients of that information. So without going on any further, I'd just like to again to thank the panel members for their contribution to a very interesting first panel. Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone, for that little break. We're going to move on now, as we said, with 3 showcase presentations. I can take my mask off while I'm here. 3 showcase presentations, which are, as I said, are going to be able to give a good overview of some of these key themes that we discussed in the first panel, and are obviously underpinning the Global Resilience Index initiative as well. And I'm delighted that we can bring a number of our colleagues to the podium, but also virtually to start to look at some of these things, the key practical elements of building the global databases that are necessary to underpin resilience equitably. And so I'd be delighted to actually introduce virtually, to start with, Nick Moody from the Insurance Development Forum, who's the program manager of the Global Risk Modelling Alliance in the IDF. We'll start with the presentation by Nick virtually. As I said, it's a real shame that Nick can't make it here, because he's been instrumental in a large amount of what's been going on, both with the IDF and with the Global Resilience Index. But I'm delighted he can still be here virtually with us. And he's going to give a quick overview on the GRMA, the Global Risk Modelling Alliance. And I hope to show how the value is going to be realised by bringing the global modelling capacity of the GRI aligned with these locally derived, detailed country-level models of risk, which can be off the same basis and the same provenance and the same standard frameworks, connecting them to give more power and more strength to those overall risk assessments at the local level, but with a global context. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nick virtually. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And Tom, can I just check live? I don't see the slides on the main screen.
I'll main screen it.
Are they perfect? Okay, thanks very much. So thanks so much, everybody, for the opportunity to comment or introduce you to the Global Risk Model Alliance. It's a proposal that's by the Risk Modeling Steering Group of the IDF, and it's about public-private partnership in risk understanding, risk and resilience understanding, I should say, for public good, and particularly for the focus area of the Insurance Development Forum, which is all about helping vulnerable economies face up to the challenges of climate change. Matt, can I just check that this is all working at the moment? The feed is, I'm not seeing the feed.
Forwards for you.
Okay, so I'll keep going. So a quick word on the Insurance Development Forum for those who are not familiar with it. It is a public-private collaboration, first launched around the time of the Paris and Climate Summit and also Sendai. It signs up for, well, its purpose is to bring private sector capability to the challenges of the SDGs and the Global 2030 Agenda. It has fully signed up for the Insular Resilience objective of adding financial protection for 500 million more people by 2025. And it does so through operational programs, those programs being both in risk transfer and in risk analytics. The headline program at the moment is a program that brings risk transfer mechanisms to 20 countries in partnership with the German government and with UNDP. And it does so by through providing risk management expertise, but also by the provision of up to $5 billion in underwriting capacity. But we're here to talk about risk analytics. And we've already heard how critical risk analysis is to climate and disaster risk strategy. So I won't reinforce those points, but what I'd rather do is just highlight what we see to be an unhappy paradox. By far the greatest investment in risk understanding is in the global north, and we've heard some big numbers already. I think I could already very easily identify somewhere between 1.6 and 1.8 billion spent annually on a very small handful of what we might describe as perils in that are very meaningful to the wealthiest countries. Very much less is spent on the needs of the most vulnerable countries, where the risks of human welfare and indeed lives is the greatest. So access to risk analytics is unequal, and that is largely due to financial imbalance. But the current supply of metrics for the risk finance that can unlock and solve that imbalance largely comes from external sources and is riven with contractual barriers and proprietary formats, which is not to say that the work being done is not good. It would just be so good if it could be made more accessible. Also, and we've heard from Kamal, for example, who made a very powerful statement, I thought, this morning about when we're talking about global resilience, ultimately, all resilience is local. And also heard from Christoph about the importance of local risk understanding. So this is really about bringing risk capability closer to the risk owners who are having to make the hard decisions in countries. But currently, these contractual barriers and proprietary formats mean that countries are unable to share a single view of risk or multiple views of risk across departments and sectors. They're unable to compare sources or indeed put global and local resources and research side by side. They're unable to see inside the models. And they don't own the analysis locally, so they can not only not see what's inside the models, but they can't develop them further. And what this results in, ultimately, is that critical local decisions are being made based on the thin evidence of somebody else's view of risk. These are not conditions that are going to create the kind of trust and confidence that is needed to unlock financial flows, whether it's for investment in adaptation or whether it's for contingent risk finance. So a solution is required. That's not only our view, I should hasten to add, because we do very often talk in a bubble at the global level about what we think is the right thing to do. But we're very glad to have been part of an agreement just last week with the V20 group of finance ministers of 55 climate vulnerable countries, who also view public-private partnership in risk and resilience understanding as an absolute priority. Here's another little piece of evidence from a World Bank survey that was done with ministries who engaged in the Sea-Drift risk pool in Asia. When asked for 7 different potential capabilities that for which they could get external help, by far the greatest one at 71% there was capability in risk modeling. So it's not that we're just saying this, we hear this over and over anecdotally as well. So what's our proposed solution? We think the solution is to partner with countries to develop local capability in finance-aware risk assessment, and to reach the stage where countries have choice and have trust in the analysis, because that surely is the means to unlock the financial flows that are so necessary. The proposal is to equip sovereign risk owners to build trusted risk finance strategies through affordable access, increased choice, and transparency of risk data inputs. And the proposal comes with 3 main components, and here's the big circle here is the first one of those. You've already heard quite a lot from panelists. James, for example, very powerfully put forward the arguments for building systems based on the OASIS infrastructure. So the first layer, if you like, or the first component of this program is around open risk modeling, use of an open risk modeling platform, and critically, the open data standards that are curated. And we're fortunate to have access to the OASIS risk modeling ecosystem and its standards, which, as James said, are increasingly being used and integrated to be made interoperable with wider ranges of standards. And right now, there's some really good work going on with integration, or rather interoperability, to create interoperability with data standards of the public sector in the World Bank. The second component of this program is to recognize that there are gaps, critical gaps in model and data content, particularly in the most vulnerable countries. Many of these can be filled by the integration and translation of existing local knowledge and local research. We shouldn't underestimate that resource. But there are also areas where new models, new data should be commissioned. The Global Resilience Index Initiative will go a long way towards helping at the strategic level, but we are also talking about gaps here in local data. And we're calling upon donors, as indeed the V20 group did last week, for donor governments to create a strategic fund on which countries can draw in order to help fill these model and data gaps. The third element of the program is the technical assistance team to work side by side with countries in co-defining, co-developing the capability that each country with its different risk profiles and different resources will need. And to do so on a learn by doing basis on applied risk projects. Put together, these 3 things are very powerful. Individually, they don't stand quite so as powerfully themselves, but put together, it's a very powerful package. But rather than going through each of these bullets, what I'd just like to highlight is a couple of key points. One of them is on the question about open risk modeling platforms and standards, the sense of community that we should be trying to create. This is a community that's both global and local. It's a community of not just model providers, but also users. And the platforms that we're talking about here are really the only way in order that we might be able to build those communities. Running short of time here, so I'm going to quickly move on to illustrate with an example. So the OASIS team actually led a couple of really innovative, I would say groundbreaking projects in the Philippines and in Bangladesh that have recently been completed. They've both led to sustainable local modeling and risk analytics understanding. This one in the Philippines, for example, was for flood. It brought together on the, looking at the logos at the top and the right-hand side of this screen, a wide range of local organizations, including, for example, the University of Philippines Engineering Department for high-resolution LiDAR data, high resolution hydromet data from Pagasa, the hydromet agency. But it also brought in, for example, the Disaster Risk Management Authority of the city of Makati, in other words, the central business district of Metro Manila, which is able to use this model for very high level, high resolution contingency planning for flood in the middle of the metropolis. The model is hosted by the national reinsurer, NatRe, and that makes it sustainable for the future, but it also means that both the private sector, the public sector, are able to share a view, a very high quality view of risk. And not only that, but it's ported to a view of climate from the global organizations that you see on the left. And as an example, Potsdam, PIK at the bottom there, was able to provide the climate scenarios, or if you like, the climate conditioning for the model, which helps the users locally to assess their risk under different warming pathways. So where are we at with this program right now? We are delighted, as I said, to have reached an agreement with the V20 group of finance ministers of 55 climate vulnerable countries. It's a real, I would say, endorsement of the demand that we suspected was there. We're also delighted to have had warm words of support from donors, particularly the German government, and Dr. Maria Schwarzbach, recently Parliamentary Secretary of State of BNZ, has been very supportive of, since the middle of the year. We're hoping also to be able to introduce further donors to support this program in the coming months, and very keen to make some kind of operational announcement in time for the G7 summit in 2020. Finally, just a quick word on how the GRI and the GRMA fit together. You've heard already the half-hour presentation on the GRI this morning. You've heard a lot of words about its relevance at the global level. And you've heard about the absolute necessity for a global reference index. What you've heard from me just now, I hope, is the local application of the Global Risk Modelling Alliance, which, as a very first step in any conversation with a country, would be using data from the Global Resilience Index to get that strategic overview and to start frame discussions about where a country's priorities might lie when it comes to operational risk programs. The GRMA is about co-development of applied risk management projects. It's about unlocking operational transactions in investment in adaptation, disaster risk management, and disaster risk finance. But what I'd really like to do in closing is to highlight the shared principles that both have, the values that both adhere to, which are around accelerating access to risk information worldwide for public good. It's around using this very powerful probabilistic approach to risk, the hazard vulnerability exposure calculation that has served the insurance industry so well. It is about open risk platforms and open data standards. And for both programs, the GRI and the GRMA, it is about building a shared language of risk, because this is, after all, if nothing else, it is all about collaboration to build resilience. Many thanks.
I just wanted to, before we move on to James, to talk about the standards, which are obviously key to what you've just said about the shared language of risk. I just again wanted to thank you again for your contribution to this, but not only that, to be pushing forwards both GRMA and then being such an instrumental partner for the GRI as well. And as I said, it's a shame you can't be with us, but thank you very much for giving that presentation on something I think which is of critical importance. And if we pick up on one thing, it's for me, it's bringing the capacity and building the capacity and transferring that knowledge to those who need to make the effective decisions at local levels. And I think that underpins everything, including obviously the need for the frameworks and standards. So I'd like to invite James to come to the podium to give hopefully a relatively short presentation as we run out of time, but please feel free to use as much as you want on the importance and need for a framework of standards, and hopefully to propose an approach that we can all work together on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt. So today, I'd like to present some thoughts on a reference framework for climate conditioning of catastrophe risk models. As we've said, these have been used in the insurance industries for more than 3 decades. This work has already begun actually with a number of the world's leading flood model providers, supported by Willis Towers Watson and NASDAQ. So there's an urgent need for common approaches to quantifying physical climate risk. Consistent ways to quantify and monitor physical risk, both present and future, are essential. A sustainable economy depends on access to finance to transfer risks in an affordable and solvent way. Changes to the physical risks we face have already occurred and are likely to continue as climate change continues. Future changes are going to occur whether we reach the net zero targets or not. Consistency and transparency, we've mentioned before, are key to confidently representing future climate impacts and making effective risk management and resilience decisions. So the insurance industry provides a common approach to modelling present day physical extremes. Climate condition cat models are starting to emerge. There's a number of vendors that are either actively working on these or have produced something already. And they can help quantify current and future changes in physical acute risk. There's, as we've also mentioned, open modelling platforms also, I'd say, starting to emerge, but they've actually been around for a while. So Oasis is one that we've mentioned before, and NASDAQ actually builds a technology platform underpinned by that Oasis framework. So we're a commercial provider leveraging an open source technology. So you can see how this stuff can start to proliferate. So, and we've already shown that the GRI and other public good initiatives are also underpinned by these catastrophe model approaches. Future changes to physical climate add a bunch of additional complexity and therefore a need for clarity. So the use of climate model outputs requires a deep knowledge and expertise in climate science and a technical capability to make appropriate use of the guidance they can provide. Different industries and users we've mentioned already have different needs, so they need different metrics, and outputs are they're at different stages of their evolution. Let's put it that way. Climate models are designed for very different purposes to catastrophe models, and these differences need to be addressed thoughtfully when combining guidance from both. Neither are perfect for understanding these types of risks, but they can provide useful guidance when understood correctly. And it's important for the provenance of any physical model to be fully understood. So correct integration and comparison between models is made and understood. So we've come up with a suggestion for a reference framework. Seems appropriate that there should be a common approach to the generation of models that address future states of climate risk. A standard approach to enabling comparison between models would support multiple stakeholders, including model developers, analysts, and decision makers. And also, I think it's important that we consider a framework for actually questioning the outputs and how these models are built. So here's an example of something that kind of shows the breakdown of the different areas that need to be thought about. So model description, that's a pretty obvious one. Then the data that underpins them. So assessing source of climate data, the provenance and the relevance, the outputs, so the use of appropriate methods for analysing climate data and adjusting catastrophe model methods, the methods themselves. So how is the model built? The methodologies that underpin that. Users need to understand that so they can represent their understanding to regulators in some cases, and the applications as well, ensuring that it's fit for purpose for the use that's kind of intended, and the interpretation of the of those results. So this you could take this even further really and say actually certain industries are going to need, they'll put more importance on some parts of this than others. So these are not obviously definitive, but just some examples. So as a bank, for example, you might put more weight on the output and the applications, and less on kind of understanding the climate models and the kind of data that underpins it. And as a insurer, quite the opposite. You might put more weight on understanding the data and slightly less on the application, because obviously these models have been around for so long. So suggestions on kind of how we could break this down and look at it in more detail. So the next steps is to create a best practice white paper. So this process has begun already, and sort of starting to capture the key considerations and metrics necessary across the range of model development, integrator and key end user stakeholders. It's important to kind of get those end user requirements, especially from markets like the financial services and corporate markets that are not, so familiar with these types of technologies. And from that, we can build a workable framework that captures the most important model conditioning parameters and output metrics. The white paper is, as I say, underway now. It's due to be released in early 2022, and will help to focus the efforts of companies building models to model the quantification of physical climate risk, and just as importantly, will help those industries and risk managers that are looking to use these models to understand them in a way that means they can report accurate metrics to their business and stakeholders. So that's it, Matt. Was that quick enough for you?
In every sense, yeah. But thanks very much for providing that very good, very succinct presentation, which is always handy. But no, thank you. We're going to move on now very quickly to the last of the showcase presentations that we're giving, which is now, as I said, a practical example of where we've been looking at how to bring together the new next generation of models, present day models of flood, trying to condition them with climate related hazard inputs in a way that's appropriate and standardized, and the ability to be able to see how they could then be driven through to final end use. We're using an example here of what we've already seen from Christoph, which is the globally consistent real asset data that the GeoAsset initiative under the SFI is producing. And so this is, I believe, is the first time this data has been used in this context to deliver a forward-looking, climate-conditioned model of natural peril for a given region. And so I'm very pleased to hand over now to my colleague, Nalan, who's going to give this overview, but bringing obviously together some of these key aspects we've already seen from our other collaborators. Thank you, Nalan.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everybody. My name is Nalan Sanal-Kabi, and I'm the head of flood risks research at Willis Research Network. I'm excited to share this project with you today, and I want to thank, first of all our collaborators, National University of Singapore, JBA, and Special Finance Initiative. This is truly a team effort. So let's start with the big picture. All these blue dots represent catastrophic flood events that have more than $100 million plus economic losses. And as you can see, flood is such a global peril, yet regional characteristics of the types of floods and their frequencies and severities dictate the by the regional characteristics of these events. So we will be focusing on Southeast Asia, and as you can see, it's no stranger to catastrophic flood events, and it happens to be one of the critical economies in the world. So we will drill down all the way to Indonesia, West Java, and Jakarta throughout this presentation, and we'll see asset level expected risk change. So climate change is a very complex problem, and to tackle it, we need to incorporate scientific perspective into business solutions. And for that, we need translators between the two worlds, collaboration of public and private sectors. That's where we come in, the Willis Research Network. We need comprehensive understanding of present and future risks, both ends of the extremes, acute and chronic risks, floods and droughts. And that's where the NUS study comes in place. And if you want to make use of this scientific insight and come up with tangible applications, we need to communicate in the same language with the industry. So that's very critical, and that's where the JBA's global flood model comes in place. And we have a bilateral agreement with JBA to modify their global flood model to include forward-looking climate. And as Matt mentioned, this is probably one of the first time anyone has attempted to apply bespoke state-of-the-art climate research directly into a flood model at this scale. And ultimately, we need, tackling climate requires open source data and flexible platform. And we need, as all the panelists mentioned, we need accurate, curated, and trusted sources of exposure data, and SFI data actually provides that. And currently, when we look at other sources of data in the industry, they're either too coarse or they're not global, or lack of transparency. So that makes it SFI data a game changer in that perspective. And obviously, there is a need to deliver these models in a way that people can use confidently to understand the key climate hazard exposure changes, assumptions, the model settings used. So NASDAQ platform provides that transparency and flexibility. So here's a schematic view of the project. We're running JBA's global probabilistic flood model using SFI's curated data, and it's again global data set to calculate present day flood risk, the baseline risk. And then up until recently, I believe Emma and Jeff mentioned that already, up until recently, flood models were only available at data-rich countries. It's one of those really hard to model perils, and having a global state-of-the-art model is just phenomenal. And WRN-funded new NUS research provides the climate change factors on flood model inputs, which is very critical. And that will allow us to condition a high resolution global flood model to represent future flood risk. And also the NUS project, NUS study provides correlated water stress and drought impacts. And that can be captured through the chronic risks. And regional focus is key here. I don't know if you can see the pointer. Yeah, the regional focus is key here because real impact of climate change on climate forcings, on floods and droughts are represented at regional scale. So it's important to bring that information from global climate models all the way to regional scale. And the resulting model, flood modeling, can generate financial risk metrics, including average annual loss or exceedance probability against real asset exposures. We talked about communicating in the same language as business does. So with JBA's model, we're going to do that. And the final model is then available at NASDAQ platform, which itself is based on OASIS, as we mentioned. And so it's an open modeling framework with open architecture, and then allows us to use open exposure data sets as inputs. So through SFI, through JBA's baseline and climate conditions projected risk, we're modeling the risk change of real assets. That's very key. So we know the owners of these assets, we know their estimated values. So through Climate Quantify, we can, with additional information on their vulnerabilities and resilience impacts, that we can assess their comprehensive risk. And in that sense, this project is aiming to be the blueprint for such analysis. And we're going to look at this, each component briefly now. But before we do, I'd like to talk very briefly about the Willis Research Network and what we do. WRN is an award-winning collaboration between academia, finance, and insurance industry. It was created to strengthen the practical links between science, policy, and industry in order to tackle the key risks of the global insurance and reinsurance industries are facing. We have over 60 partners globally, and most of them have been with us since day one. And this year, we're celebrating our 15th year anniversary. So we're very proud of the work that we've done so far. And one of the key projects that we have in our flood risks research hub is the Southeast Asia project. And with our long-term partners, National University of Singapore, and under the supervision of Professor Yui Leong, NUS team created the climate change impact on precipitation distributions and drought indexes in Southeast Asia. So this insight is key because it takes the information from 3 global models and with dynamical downscaling, enhances the model resolution, as you can see over here. Oops, sorry. Enhances the model resolution and captures the localized extremes in Southeast Asia. So for outputs, we're getting % change in high resolution variables such as daily precipitation, which can be consumed by a flood model directly. And we're getting outputs based on 3 global climate models and the ensemble. So that gives us the range of the uncertainties. And under 2 RCP scenarios for 3 time periods, present day, near term, and long term, various precipitation and temperature variables are calculated. So we're getting the correlated realistic insight on floods and droughts for both ends of the hydrometeorological extremes. You can't just apply macro scale global climate scenarios onto physical hazards. You need to understand the local drivers of precipitation and temperature. So and that's why NUS's research is a significant component for this particular project. So here we're looking at one of the simulation outputs. On the top right panel, you can see the projected annual maximum daily precipitation change for the long-term future. And underneath, you can see the time series of Jakarta. And you can see the current day, present day Jakarta precipitation value is 150 millimeter per day. And over time, it goes up to 3 times the present day value, which is phenomenal. And on the right-hand side, we see on the top left corner, we see the temperature, spatial variation of temperature change in the same model domain. And then for the same city, again, we can see the temperature of the present day, which is at 28 Celsius degree. And over time, it gets pretty significant. So keep in mind that Jakarta is struggling with present day flood risk to begin with. So projected view is ringing the alarm bells even more. And so if we were to look at JBA's model now, as we said, this is a global model. So JBA model covers all these regions at high resolution. And their global events catalog has 15 million simulated events, and 2 million of it happens to be in Southeast Asia region. And as I said, we will be focusing, drilling down all the way to Indonesia, West Java, and Jakarta region. And you can see how detailed the flood footprints are, how detailed, how high resolution the model outputs are. And then we will see one of the key things about this JBA's model is they have this fly tool that you can change hazard and vulnerability variables on the fly. And you can also calculate present day with this project, calculate the present day and future flood risk at location level. And the model estimates annual average losses for individual countries in Southeast Asia. And the dark orange indicates highest risk to flood based on GDP. And Indonesia is one of the highest risk countries in the region. So here on this slide, we see end-to-end process of adjusting JBA's flood model to simulate future flood risks. But ultimately, JBA is creating the climate condition stochastic event set here. And but the key part is this. It's not just adjusting event frequencies and severities on the catalog as a post-process. It's very key. It is changing the precipitation and temperature inputs in the rainfall runoff model at catchment level, meaning physically modeling flood response under climate conditions, future climate conditions. So flood models at their core continuously simulate the water cycle, and rain comes in, saturates the ground, some of it evaporates, and the rest refills the rivers and the lakes. But the excess causes floods, but sometimes due to lack of rain, evaporation takes away the stored water from the ground and the water bodies, and you'll end up having droughts and water stresses. So it all happens at catchment level. So the JBA model translates the NUS research inputs into catchment level flood response. So it's very important to point that out. Using SFI data, as we mentioned several times during the panel discussion, we truly get the digital footprint of the global economy. Exposure is a dynamic input, changes every day. Having this curated open source consistent database is a major advantage to analyze climate change impact on key asset classes. In addition to the lat-long location of these assets, they provide the key attributes such as the LEI codes, ownership data, and plant ages. Those you don't come across with those that information quite easily. So having this level of data helps us significantly with comprehensive risk assessment. And we know that assets and ultimately economies and societies are exposed to both ends of the hydrometeorological extremes, particularly that the assets themselves are affected by both in different ways. Water-dependent activities like cement and steel production can have material risks from both floods and water stress, and these can be manifested in different ways throughout their operational and performance of these assets over their life cycles. So if we were to look at those water-intensive productions, such as cement and steel plants, we see a massive global footprint, and a decent number of them are located in Southeast Asia region. And if we were to zoom in further to West Java and Indonesia and overlay the projected precipitation distribution maps from NUS, from present day to midterm future to long-term future, you can see the map is getting more blue over time. And that means these assets are exposed to more risks that needs to be mitigated in order to safeguard the cement and steel production in the area. Obviously, this is a physical risk project, but changes in physical risks on water-dependent industries will impact transition risks as well. And steel and cement plants can be good examples of this linkage. As I said, floods and droughts correspond to the two ends of the hydrometeorological extremes. In pretty much all the projects that are out there, the focus is either on floods or droughts. And most of the time, people use two separate sources of data to calculate those two risks. But in reality, they're correlated, they're linked. So it's better to capture both extremes in one data set, which NUS's data research calculates both, as I said, the precipitation distributions as well as the drought indexes. Therefore, they're explicitly capturing this correlation between the two extremes. And by using these low flow projections can estimate the change in operational capacities of water-dependent assets such as these steel and cement plants. And as you can see on the right-hand side panel, RCP 8.5 long-term projections suggest that severe droughts is on its way in Java. So, as I mentioned, and many of the panelists mentioned, that it's very critical to communicate these changes in metrics that the industry is accustomed to use for risk management. Here we're looking at a very typical exceedance probability curve right here, loss on the y-axis and then return period on the x-axis, so known as the EP curve, which describes the probability that various levels of loss will be expected. An EP curve is generated by running a model event catalog against exposure and obtaining losses for each simulated event and year, and ranking those losses based on their probability of occurrence, or 1 over it, which is the return period. And the EP curve is the basis on which insurers estimate their likelihood of experiencing various levels of loss. So this plot shows the portfolio level risk change compared to the present day baseline risk. So if we were to look at, let's say, 100 or 200 year return period, you can see over time the baseline risk corresponds to that return period of loss corresponds to a larger loss. So, so it's in the long term, we're going to see higher losses. It's projected to see higher losses, or vice versa. If you were to look at the loss axis and on a fixed loss over years, over the various scenarios, the same loss becomes more frequent. It used to be, let's say, that one becomes 500-year return period loss, but now it comes closer and closer, and it becomes much more frequent. And similarly, we can see location level asset specific change using JBA's model, which shows material impact on this particular steel plant near Jakarta, right there. So to sum up, and couple takeaway messages, our initial analysis indicate that precipitation can increase up to 3 times in Southeast Asia. That can translate into 21% annual average loss increase in steel and cement plants in West Java. And we need regional solutions to this global problem. And with this project, we're aiming to provide you the overarching framework to integrate flood risk with water stress at asset level for various industries. So, thank you.
It has taken 15 years for that idea to be delivered. Because, for those of you not in this sector, what you've just seen is a global to integrate them with globally linkable catastrophe and then be able to apply those at regional scale down to an asset level to generate return period financial activity, party mobility. What you've just seen, I know to many will look like, okay, it is an absolutely wow moment. It's taken 15 years. Not Willis Towers Watson's work, it's the collective endeavor of so many different moments and communities that is actually now been orchestrated. So this, and people say the future isn't predictable. Fortunately, the world of data is predictable. I can assure you what you're seeing here in terms of how the physical world, and by that I mean populations, assets, and how they're going to be affected by that, is more predictable than almost any other economic, political, or social future. And I have no doubt, and this is going to be the basis of how the Global Resilience Index Initiative operates, and how many other things. What we're seeing here, what people read about in the conversation space since the COP process began in 1990, an ability to see the future impact of climate down to an individual scale, right across to a global scale. It's a huge achievement. Everyone's efforts to get to this place. And by the next COP, I think
Thanks, Rome, for that. And thank you, Nalan, for an amazingly concise and very impressive overview of that connective approach to bringing all those things together. As Rowan said, it's taken the collective efforts of many people to get us to this point just generally, and I think it does set a very clear signpost to where things like the GRI and the GRMA and then the broader modelling community can go to support transparent and trusted risk assessments. So thank you very much. We are running short of time. In fact, we're going to be over time, but this has been such fun. I don't really care. I hope you're feeling the same. But what I'd like to do is just to introduce now the second and final part of our panel sessions, where we're going to, as I said at the start, to look more now at the demand needs of these types of models. It's not just about the technology. We've seen great technology. We've seen great ideas around how we can deliver the tools and the analytics, but there's got to be a reason. And that reason has to reflect the needs of the stakeholder communities, which will ultimately benefit through increased confidence around resilience decisions and in a collective way. And so I'm very pleased to be able to invite a number of experts who have real insight into this area onto the panel now. Two actually physically on the panel, but we're also going to be joined virtually by other partners as well. So if I can just ask Nicola Ranger, who is going to join us as Deputy Director, as you know, of the UK Centre for Greening Finance and Investment, and then Rua Matsika, who is an analyst at the Quadrilla Climate Foundation, to join us on the panel, and welcome. And then virtually, we're also going to be joined by Antoine Bavandi, who is a Senior Risk Finance Specialist at the World Bank, on the virtual link. John Schneider, who Rowan's already mentioned, is the Secretary General of the Global Earthquake Model Foundation. And to welcome back Nick Moody, who's coming back for a second stint with us as Programme Manager of the Insurance Development Forum. So virtually welcome to those colleagues as well. We're going to have to go quite quickly, so I hope you don't mind me asking for your responses to these questions to be brief, and I will try and be brief as well now. So in the sense of this panel, as I said, it's about the demand side of what we're doing this for. Why are we doing this? And so the question I'm really asking all of you is, where do you see the most impact coming from this provision of open source data? Where does it really support global resilience? And how do you think we can actually best deliver this to the stakeholders? Because obviously they need to have the information that's most appropriate to their own requirements and challenges. I'd like to start with Nicola, if that's okay. And so from your perspective in the CGFI, where do you think public-private sector collaborations like what we're seeing today on analytics, the technologies, be most effective then in encouraging and realising that increased resilience to physical climate risk?
Thank you, Matt, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to make three hopefully brief points in response to that. So as Ben laid out at the beginning in introducing CGFI, so our work is at CGFI is around bringing understanding of risk into the financial sector. So we work with financial institutions, both public and private, to do that. And I see three key areas where we at CGFI and all of us here as sort of experts in this area can most have impact over the next few years. And these are areas that are very much needed. So one is, and I made this point in my slightly embarrassing video earlier, I think a key thing that we need to do is bring in risk into decision making at all levels. Now that sounds simultaneously like a really easy thing and a really hard thing to do, and it is extremely difficult. And I think fundamentally what we know now is that across the financial system, as well as beyond finance, we're not bringing physical climate risk into decision making yet. So there's evidence that across investment, for example, we're not considering physical climate risks at the moment. So there's an underestimate of risks, there's a mispricing of risk. Now that has impacts both to those financial institutions themselves, because there's a material risk there that's not being properly captured, but it also has a bigger societal risk. It has a societal risk because if we're not pricing risk appropriately in decision-making in financial institutions, then that risk signal isn't going to corporates, homeowners, etc., and the incentives are not in place for people to actually manage that risk. So open data is absolutely essential both to help that process. And I think critically, having that openly available to everyone is what's absolutely essential in terms of creating that level playing field in understanding of risk that's very much needed. So that's my first area, but that's not new. We know that needs to happen. I think the area that I'm very keen to push, and we are in CGFI over the next year or so, is how we align broader financial flows with adaptation resilience goals. So we've heard at COP a lot about aligning financial flows with net zero targets, for example, but adaptation and resilience has been largely missing from that. And I know each of us here are converts to adaptation and resilience, but we need that same process to happen now. And to give you an example of why we need that to happen, if you imagine currently all adaptation finance, so what they'll be talking about a mile down the road, is only around at most 80 billion a year. That sounds like a lot, but it's a drop in the ocean compared to what is needed. And if you imagine just for the infrastructure sector globally, $2.7 trillion a year is going into infrastructure investment. So we have a little measly amount of adaptation finance going in one way and a tidal wave of finance going in the other way, which is not accounting for resilience needs. And that's just for infrastructure. And that's, again, a tiny drop in the ocean compared to all financial flows. So at the moment, we have financial flows which are not taking into account risk, which are literally dwarfing adaptation flows at the moment. So we really need to bring that understanding of risk that we all have here into those broader financial flows. And there's quite a lot that needs to happen to do that. There are changes, and it's great to see, for example, we've got Danielle here from the IIGCC on the investor side. So there's real investor expectations now for financial institutions and others to be aligned, to be thinking about resilience and risk. So it's great to see that from the investment community. And I think this is something that I'm very, very keen to see over the next year, is that understanding of the importance of resilience to come on a par with the net zero. My final point, and this one's a brief one, Matt. So obviously the other area, and Ben Caldicott mentioned this, is all the opportunities around this. So to capture all these opportunities from investing in resilience, resilience bonds, resilience-linked financial instruments, we need data. And again, this open data is essential for that. And I think there's a real missing piece at the moment, and this is my final point, and this is where I'm particularly excited about what we're doing at Oxford, is understanding systemic level risks. And this is where we have to go beyond what the frameworks that insurance have built, because insurers don't historically really look at how different risks are interconnected across systems. And we know from COVID that's where the big risks come from. It's how risks are amplifying across systems. And at the moment, we don't have the tools to even understand those risks, let alone to begin to manage them. So that's something that we're very focused on in GRI, is to try to build that understanding of systems, be it food systems, infrastructure systems, etc. So we can then look, using an insurance-based approach, looking at how we can better manage those risks. And that's where things like, coming back to the question on public-private partnerships, have to come in, because we need the public sector and the private sector to come together with this common understanding of risk and put in place the frameworks and tools to manage these risks. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Nicola. Moving directly to Rua. Obviously, we talked about this before, but obviously from your perspective, mitigation, I think, has been a key perspective, obviously at COP and more broadly. And that's included, the development of data and metrics to support the transition agenda. Now, obviously, there's a growing concern. I think it's fair to say that we've seen already that there's a concern that physical risk had probably been understated in that sense, and particularly for those more vulnerable countries, where obviously, regardless of achieving net 1.5 degree targets, the physical hazards are there and they're going to increase regardless. And so I was going to ask really how you feel from your perspective in the Quadratary Foundation, how that global modelling and analytics communities that you've seen today, and we talked about how they can best assist countries now in the threats that are posed to them, and how you think really we can start to build that capacity, what's needed.
Well, thanks, Matt. I guess first off is to start with, what am I doing here? I work for a mitigation-focused philanthropy we really work on the mitigation side. So why would I be sitting here? But the reality is that we all know that we need to front load mitigation efforts to minimize future physical risks. And that's our entry point into the conversation. There's no question that climate vulnerable nations are facing the heaviest impacts. I'm from a climate vulnerable nation, so I have very real, visceral childhood memories of the devastation that's left behind when there is an extreme weather event. And what happens when a developing nation is not necessarily equipped to be able to plan well and to roll out adaptation measures that enable resilience. But I think what's critical to understand is also that we are all at risk. And so the mitigation question, of course, it's very important. We must reach those 1.5 degree targets. We must reach those net zero emission targets. It's really, really critical. But at the same time, we know that for billions of people, not just in climate vulnerable nations, but in climate vulnerable communities that have lower adaptive capacity, climate change is not if, it's not when, it's happening now. And so the investment into adaptation and resilience measures is equally as important, and we should be looking at that right now. So I'm really excited to be sitting here at the launch of the GRI and the GRMA. It's a much needed initiative, and I applaud the people in this room for spearheading this kind of initiative. But access to the latest models and data and climate risk forecasts, yes, it's important. Yes, we need the tools, but there is still a job to do. And that job to do is in ensuring that the end users and that in-between space between the platform itself and the end users and the communities that are at the forefront of the climate emergency, that there's actually the capacity to translate these important climate risk analytics into operational, usable pieces of information that inform climate responsive planning and adaptation measures so that we avoid as much as possible the risk of maladaptation. And that's very real if you are making plans based on irrelevant data. I think, what can we do? Well, I think that means that we need to strengthen capacity at country level, right? We need to think about who are the end users in that information value chain and ensure that they have the capacity to actually engage and interrogate these models, not just understand that this is a model, it's a black box, I need to press X and Y and out comes an answer, but actually understand where the uncertainties are. And that requires partnership with the modelers and a little bit of honesty on both sides to point out where the limitations are, where the data gaps and uncertainties are, but not from a finger pointing perspective at all. In the notion and the spirit of building partnership, because what we want is to see country-led and local-led climate risk data pools developing, the kind of partnerships that allow for data models that are enriched by local experience, but local data and data collection exercises. And I think, ultimately what we want to see is that we would like to promote local and country-led data sharing initiatives. We would want to see that there is data sharing and model accessibility, not just at town or municipal or subnational level, but between nations, because as we all know, climate change and climate impacts don't respect political boundaries. And I think that this can only be delivered through enhanced collaboration and strategic partnerships, such as what is enabled by platforms like the GRI and GRMA. And I think that I'm really honored to be sitting here and part of this process and conversation, because it's going to take all of us. In as much as we need the public-private partnerships, we also need philanthropy and donor to come forward and do their part to help catalyze and scale these initiatives. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much for those very, very pertinent points. And that actually brings me nicely then to move on to Antoine Bavandi, who's virtually on this session. So Antoine, if you can hear me, at the World Bank, you've pioneered the use of physical risk models and the associated data, particularly using innovative sources, directly into the development of risk transfer mechanisms to support countries and to build the capacity in those countries directly. And I just wanted to know, from your perspective at the bank and your own personal perspective, what's your view on how effective global modelling, as you've seen we're discussing today, global modelling, but aligned with standards to allow the integration of country level or regional level modeling, how that can help to improve that capacity. As Ru has pointed out, and Nicola already said as well, it's about giving the knowledge to those who make the decisions and having the trust. So I'd like to get your sense on that, please.
Many thanks, Matt and team, and I'm very excited to be here. Hope you can hear me okay. I'll try and be brief. At the World Bank Crisis and Disaster Risk Finance team, we have been supporting a number of developing country clients over the past decade and at various levels, including ministries of finance, central banks, insurance regulators, but also humanitarian partners. So we understand very well the need for a consolidated, consistent platform, but also a platform that addresses a wide range of applications. And I will use two simple examples to try and highlight the key role of open data for these very different applications, which I think is one of the key challenges also that GRI is trying to address. The first example is the Next Generation Drought Index, which aims to produce state-of-the-art, let's say, drought risk assessment solely based on public open data. So in other words, we believe that open data is sufficient for drought risk financing. It's mostly a matter of combining different sources of data and calibrating, verifying, validating that data on the ground with our country clients. And most of that data we are using is based on, let's say, satellite constellations, or ground stations. So one of the key issues is trying to process that and streamline the access of that data for decision makers on the ground. The other example that I wanted to highlight today is our work to support central banks assess and monitor climate physical risk. Particularly relevant to GRI is our, let's say, work to the regional central bank of West African countries, BCAO, for which we leveraged global exposure and hazard information for 8 different countries, different sectors, very, very different geographies, and digging into the financial vulnerability of banks to droughts, floods, heat waves, sea level rise. To effectively help address the question, could climate risk pose a systemic risk to banks and the financial sector in West Africa? So you can see that the range of applications is really wide, and the needs and applications ultimately would be very, very different. So that is why, in our view, a global platform is critical in sort of supporting these either sort of basic or low capacity engagements, or let's say nascent new engagements with sort of the first stepping stones towards more sophistication, more customization, and more country-specific assessment. I'll conclude here, and I'm happy to answer questions just for the sake of time, but to achieve scale and maximize impact, but also to avoid overlap and confusion possibly of clients and the community with an additional initiative, I think it will be critical indeed to leverage the right level of expertise and the right partners for the right applications, because you can tell from what I just described that, you know, if you look at drought and everything else, you already have kind of 2 different methodologies and 2 very, very different mindsets. And I'm confident that the team will be able to nuance their approach. And we at the World Bank are definitely looking forward to supporting this initiative going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antoine. So obviously, I think clearly what we're seeing already on this panel is that we do need to work together. There needs to be that collective approach and endeavour to create the data. In addition to that, obviously, we need the structures, the framework and the operational approaches which will deliver it at that different, very varying scales, whether it's at the local or the global or even at the country level. So I wanted to now hand over the question to John Schneider. As we said, he's the Secretary General of the Global Earthquake Model. Foundation, which is now 12 years old, I believe, John. Clearly, there are synergies with what GEM has achieved and delivered over the last 12 years to the intents around the climate agenda and what the GRI, GRMA, and the other collaborative agencies and groups are trying to achieve now with climate. We've seen it today, how that's starting. I just wanted to ask you a question on what advice, actually, from your perspective, having done this, what advice you would give to all of us developing these global climate risk models and the metrics that are needed to support the stakeholders, and about how you think we can best deliver those to the trust levels and in terms of the source valuation and the provenance that's needed.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks very much. Also for the opportunity to speak to all of you today. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the great effort by GEM's risk modeling team led by Vitor Silva, and together with Nicole, Paul, and Amir Taharian for putting together the combined earthquake and flood hazard and building exposure information that was shown in Nicola's video presentation. GEM is very much part of the current modeling effort as well. We're very much, although we focus very heavily on earthquake, a lot of what we do is now contributing to multi-hazard risk assessment and hopefully to the broader climate change risk modeling effort as well. As has been mentioned, GEM was formed with the idea of building a global public-private partnership to address earthquake risk globally 12 years ago. And I'd say it's important to mention that the part of the keys to GEM to this day are its 4 founding principles or core values: openness, collaboration, public good, and credible science. And we hold these up every day to make sure we're staying on the right track. We've worked very hard to develop a global collaboration network and on developing OpenQuake, which is our open source software for assessing earthquake hazard and risk, from single site through to global risk assessment. And I think it's important here that for us, providing software and training freely and openly for scientists and engineers has been an important part of our equation, at least in gaining trust from our partners, so that they in turn have been willing to provide their own data freely and openly and to work with us. Also important has been to develop products for downstream users, such as for risk managers and policymakers, and for that matter, the general public. So through this, we've been able to help governments to develop national seismic building codes. We work with organizations and countries to develop their capacity for risk assessment. So we believe very strongly in thinking globally with respect to the science and the methodologies and the tools, but very much acting locally, providing those methodologies, standards, tools, and then drawing information from local experts to tailor solutions to their problems. This approach has been key to our developing trust in collaboration and to assure that ownership in the resulting models is also local and therefore much more likely to be valued and used. So GEM is really pleased to be part of the Global Resilience Initiative, Index Initiative, and to contribute risk information and tools, as well as to share our experience in creating and operating a global collaboration network. One thing I'd like to mention, for instance, modeling future or what we call dynamic exposure is one thing that we also think we can contribute. For this is a very important factor as well in influencing changing risk over time. So we started out with a single focus on earthquake risk, but we are now part of a much bigger movement to build integrated risk models that are driven by the need for common databases, common modeling methodologies and tools, as well as common risk metrics. that are needed to address the broader mission to achieve our goal for resilience. So thanks very much for the opportunity.
And we'll come back, I hope, in the summary on some of those key points you said. I just want to quickly hand over back to Nick Moody for the final word on the panel. Nick, if you're still there, if you can give a quick sense from your perspective, again, from the GRMA, from the IDF, from your experience more broadly, where you think we should be going. What do you think we should be delivering to the wider client base?
Thanks, Matt. So I'm going to just introduce a new theme right at the end. I hope everybody might be able to just think about this afterwards. Because it occurs to me, just thinking about all the excellent content that we've been hearing today, it occurs to me that what we're part of here is nothing short of system change. Or as John used the word movement just now, and I think that's also very descriptive of what it is we're trying to do. And I would just absolutely the words that Rua had for us around the importance of this being all about the decisions being in the hands of the users, where the hard decisions have to be made, and that's the end point here. This is about, as Nicola said, it's about releasing financial flows, but it's how what interests me is how we get to the if you like the easiest route to making that possible. What is the process that builds the greatest trust in the analysis locally, that allows local ownership of the analysis in order to build that trust, but also reduces the barriers? And the new thought that I'd like to bring in is one around complexity. Many of us are very involved, well, particularly many of the practitioners in the room there are very involved in the complexities of risk analysis, and particularly catastrophe risk modeling. What interests me is whether we might be able to find a way of reducing the, if you like, the rabbit in the headlights look when we start to talk about some of that complexity with end users and countries. So we're doing some exciting work, I think, in the risk modeling group with Oasis, where we think we might be able to produce a slightly more accessible tool. Because if we are going to turn this into a movement, or system change, then we really need to be able to multiply the user base. And for a technically capable person, a GIS capable person, for example, in a ministry or a disaster risk management agency in a country, to be able to look at a screen, understand very quickly the hazard, vulnerability, exposure construct, use the open data standards and the open platforms, but use it in a very accessible way, still to achieve meaningful results that inform local decision making. I think that's a way in which we're really going to multiply up this movement. And in many respects, as was said earlier, the introduction of climate warming pathways and scenarios does add complexity, but that's also something we've got to build in and really make accessible to the end users whom we ultimately seek to serve. Thanks, Matt, for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm just going to finish by saying I think everything I've heard today, and I hope everybody in this room and virtually as well, that analytics do matter. I think if we would go back to the start of this session, we said this, analytics matters. It matters because it is the foundation of a trusted and effective decision-making support system that can be used by everybody, by us all together in a collaboration, whether it's the financial sector, whether it's governments, whether it's local populations. This underpins trusted and confident decision-making. And as John Schneider said, around what the GEM Foundation is based on, it's the same thing, I think, for the climate challenge as well. Openness, collaboration, public good, and credible science. And I just want to leave us with those key thoughts. And just to thank all of the speakers on this panel. Sorry, Nicola, please.
Final thought, which was, well, firstly, thank you so much to Willis for hosting us today and organising this event. And thank you to the IDF as well for all the support to get us here today, and to our other GRI partners. And also thank you to you all for being here and online as well. And I just want to leave us with one thought in the sort of next steps towards COP27. and I'm not sure if it was Rowan that said this, but it's a very Rowan thing to say, which is COP27 should be the adaptation COP. And I think we all need to come together to make that happen. I see, many friends here. It's great to see, CDC here as well. I know you've been a real supporter on this. Impact's great to see you here as well. All of our risk modeling friends, friends at Willis. And I think, together we can really push this forward. And I'm very grateful for you being here and hope that we can continue to work together over the next year towards the adaptation COP.
Well said, Nicola. Thank you. And I just want to thank all of the speakers and collaborators today. Thank you very much to everybody for this. I also want to thank my colleagues Felicity Carus, Frankie Brown, Tom Previtt, and Lydia Missling, who've put a lot of effort into organising today's session, and without them this would have been very difficult to do. So thank you very much. And then also to our GCU hosts and colleagues, and thanks very much for the AV support, which has been most effective, and thank you. So I just want to finish off by saying thank you everybody for your time. Thank you everybody for your interest in this, and we'll see everybody at COP27 with the fully functioning operational Global Resilience Index initiative. Thank you very much.